Right now, as you are listening to this analysis, you could be operating on just 40% of your total kidney function, and your body would not give you a single clinical sign.
Precisely. There is no radiating pain, no sudden fever.
Right. There's no immediate neurological feedback to indicate that the microscopic structures responsible for keeping your blood free of lethal toxins are quietly failing.
And that is a staggering clinical reality. We are so accustomed to a physiological architecture that broadcasts its distress. A localized infection produces heat and swelling.
Or a respiratory pathogen induces an immediate cough reflex.
Exactly. But renal decline operates under a completely different paradigm. It is an insidious, asymptomatic progression.
Because the clinical reality of renal pathology is that the kidneys possess a profound compensatory reserve. I mean, they are designed to filter roughly 180 liters of fluid daily.
Yes, so the initial loss of filtration units, the nephrons, is entirely masked. The remaining healthy units simply, well, they work harder to carry the load.
And the systemic alarm bells only ring when that compensatory mechanism finally collapses, which is often when irreversible structural damage has already occurred.
Correct. That delayed diagnostic window is essentially the foundation of our analysis today.
Welcome to our formal physiological review of renal preservation. Today, we are undertaking a comprehensive evaluation of how to actively protect and structurally repair the renal filtration system.
Specifically tailored for adults over the age of 60.
Right. We are analyzing a clinical presentation delivered by Dr. Richard Ben. He is a longevity researcher who has formulated what he terms the 3-step morning routine that repaired your kidneys fast after 60.
And our objective here is not simply to outline this protocol, but to rigorously dissect the cellular mechanisms, the metabolic pathways, and the hemodynamic shifts that validate these interventions.
I mean, the real value of this specific source material lies in its translation of complex nephrological principles into actionable daily cellular maintenance.
Yes, the protocol intervenes at the most critical juncture of the human circadian cycle, which is the transition from nocturnal fasting and repair to daytime metabolic activity.
It isolates the first 60 minutes of the waking day as the primary determinant of renal longevity.
Right.
And the epidemiological data underscores the urgency of this intervention.
It really does. If we review the 2023 demographic assessments from the National Kidney Foundation, we observe a staggering prevalence of diminished glomerular filtration rates among the senior population.
We are observing millions of individuals who interpret chronic fatigue, mild cognitive impairment, or peripheral edema as the inevitable consequences of cellular senescence.
Right, they categorize their symptoms as simply getting older.
Exactly, when in reality, they are experiencing chronic low-grade uremia because their internal filtration matrix is fundamentally compromised.
Furthermore, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released corroborating longitudinal data in 2022, emphasizing that chronological age is not the primary driver of this decline.
It's the lifestyle rhythms.
Precisely. The CDC data isolates daily lifestyle rhythms, specifically the morning metabolic environment we subject our organs to as the dominant variable.
We are either establishing an environment of endothelial protection, or we are systematically inducing cumulative microtraumas to the renal tissue every single morning.
Well stated. So let us establish the physiological baseline. To comprehend the rationale behind the first intervention, we must meticulously examine the biological state of the human body at the precise moment of waking.
Because we're not starting from a state of homeostasis. The waking body is, by definition, operating under a severe fluid deficit.
And a state of high metabolic toxicity. Consider the hemodynamics of sleep. For a period of 6 to 8 hours, the body receives zero fluid intake.
But the basal metabolic rate does not halt.
No, not at all. Cellular respiration, tissue repair, and the neutralization of metabolic byproducts continue continuously.
Right, and the kidneys are tasked with filtering this continuous stream of waste, but they are forced to perform this filtration in an increasingly hypovolemic or low-volume environment.
Exactly. To conserve water, the posterior pituitary gland secretes antidiuretic hormone, which signals the kidneys to reabsorb as much water as possible back into the bloodstream.
And the consequence of that fluid conservation is an intensely concentrated accumulation of waste within the renal tubules. The urine becomes hyperosmolar.
The toxins, the heavy metals, and nitrogenous waste are essentially compacted.
Right, so if we visualize the body's nighttime repair mechanisms as a sanitation crew.
That is an apt analogy, yes.
They have spent the entire night sweeping systemic cellular debris into localized, highly concentrated deposits.
Yeah.
But without an influx of a solvent, specifically water, that debris cannot be mobilized.
It remains static within the delicate architecture of the kidney. The specific gravity of the morning urine reflects this toxicity.
And the longer those concentrated compounds remain static, the higher the probability of precipitation, right?
Correct. Where dissolved minerals crystallize and cause physical trauma to the epithelial lining of the urinary tract.
So the very first action taken upon waking dictates whether this concentrated toxic load is successfully evacuated or whether it is allowed to induce oxidative stress upon the renal tissue.
Which introduces Dr. Ben's primary intervention, the introduction of specific citrus compounds prior to any other dietary intake.
Yes, the protocol dictates consuming a glass of lukewarm water infused with the juice of half a lemon strictly before the ingestion of caffeine, tea, or any solid food.
Now, on a superficial level, prescribing an acidic fluid to an already stressed hyperosmolar system appears contradictory.
It does. I mean, the prevailing nutritional concern among older demographics often centers on mitigating systemic acidity, right? Preserving dental enamel, preventing gastroesophageal reflux.
Absolutely. Subjecting the gastric mucosa to concentrated citric acid requires biochemical justification.
And that justification relies on understanding hepatic metabolism.
Yes, the apprehension regarding lemon juice is rooted in its low pH in vitro. However, human digestion fundamentally alters its chemical profile.
Right. When lemon juice is ingested, the citric acid is rapidly metabolized by the liver. The resulting metabolic byproducts, often referred to as the ash, are predominantly alkaline.
Precisely. It actively raises the pH of the urine, creating an environment hostile to the formation of uric acid stones.
But the primary therapeutic target is not just the pH shift, is it? It is the delivery of a specific organic molecule, citrate.
Exactly. Let us examine the molecular function of citrate within the renal system. We are identifying citrate as a chemical shield.
The National Kidney Foundation published an extensive analysis in 2014 evaluating the efficacy of dietary citrate. And the data demonstrated that elevating urinary citrate concentrations correlates with a reduction in renal calculus or kidney stone formation by up to 30%.
A 30% reduction achieved without pharmaceutical intervention necessitates a look at the precise molecular mechanics at play.
Well, the mechanism is a matter of competitive binding and thermodynamics, right?
It is. Dehydration naturally increases the concentration of calcium and oxalate ions in the urine. Because these ions carry opposite electrical charges, they are highly attracted to one another.
And when they bond, they form calcium oxalate, which is a highly insoluble compound that crystallizes into microscopic, jagged structures.
Correct. As these structures accumulate, they form obstructive renal calculi. But citrate disrupts this thermodynamic inevitability.
Because it possesses a stronger affinity for calcium than oxalate does.
Precisely. So citrate acts as an interceptor. It physically occupies the binding sites on the calcium ions, creating a soluble complex known as calcium citrate.
By binding to the calcium first, the citrate effectively neutralizes the ion, rendering it incapable of bonding with the oxalates. You are structurally preventing the precipitation of the crystal.
The Mayo Clinic actually corroborated this exact localized mechanism in a 2019 longitudinal study.
Right, noting that citrate not only prevents new crystallization,
Yeah.
but can actively coat existing microscopic crystals.
Yes, preventing their aggregation into larger symptomatic stones. And beyond the prevention of crystallization, this targeted hydration protocol exerts profound effects on uric acid clearance.
Uric acid being a byproduct of purine metabolism.
Correct. In older adults, the efficiency of uric acid excretion declines, leading to hyperuricemia.
And this elevated uric acid does not merely strain the renal filtration barriers. It precipitates in the peripheral joints, initiating the severe inflammatory cascades associated with gout.
Right. By introducing lukewarm fluid and citrate, we stimulate vasodilation in the gastric tract, encouraging rapid fluid absorption.
Which initiates a gentle, non-stressful diuresis that flushes out the accumulated overnight uric acid.
The clinical relevance of this is highlighted in the source material through the case study of James Wick, a 67-year-old male presenting with chronic fatigue, peripheral edema, and persistent bilateral lumbar discomfort.
His presentation is a classic manifestation of subclinical renal strain.
It is, and his diagnostic error did not lie in his diet, but in his morning hydration sequence. His established protocol upon waking was the consumption of highly concentrated, caffeinated black tea.
Which is severely problematic. The introduction of a caffeinated diuretic into an already hypovolemic, toxin-dense system is biologically counterproductive.
Because caffeine functions as an adenosine receptor antagonist and a mild diuretic, it actively forces the kidneys to excrete sodium and water.
It is the physiological equivalent of wringing out a sponge that is already bone dry.
That is an exact mechanical description, yes.
You are demanding that the renal system excrete fluid volume that it does not currently possess. This forces the nephrons to operate under extreme osmotic pressure.
Increasing the friction and mechanical shear stress on the cellular walls. The waste products are not being flushed. The tissue is simply being agitated.
The clinical intervention for this patient required 0 pharmaceutical additions, though. The protocol demanded a single behavioral modification for 30 days, substituting the morning diuretic with the lukewarm citrate infusion.
And the physiological parameters shifted predictably. The patient reported a systemic decrease in lethargy, the resolution of the lumbar discomfort, and a subjective feeling of reduced systemic burden.
However, Dr. Ben's analysis of this case is appropriately cautious regarding the timeline of cellular repair.
Yes, we must be clear on this. While subjective improvements in gastrointestinal motility and fatigue can manifest within 2 to 4 weeks, primarily due to improved hydration and the reduction of circulating uric acid,
The actual structural regeneration of the nephrons requires a significantly longer horizon.
we must adhere to the biological limits of cellular turnover. The epithelial cells lining the renal tubules require sustained periods of reduced oxidative stress to initiate apoptosis of damaged cells.
Right, and the subsequent proliferation of healthy tissue. This is not an acute intervention. It is a chronic environmental modification.
The therapeutic value is entirely dependent on the unrelenting consistency of the daily exposure to the citrate and the hydration volume.
Now, if we establish that the requisite fluid volume is now present, we encounter a secondary physiological barrier. Fluid absorbed into the gastric tract is functionally useless to the nephrons unless the systemic circulation can actively transport it to the renal arteries.
This necessitates an examination of the systemic hemodynamics immediately following a sleep cycle. The body may be hydrated, but the transportation network is severely compromised.
Because the transition from recumbency to an active state requires massive vascular recalibration.
During sleep, peripheral vascular resistance increases, and the resting heart rate drops significantly.
And the skeletal muscles are inactive, meaning the muscular pump that assists in venous return is entirely dormant.
Consequently, blood pools in the venous system and the overall microvascular perfusion to the internal organs, including the kidneys, is at its absolute diurnal nadir.
The anatomical positioning of the kidneys exacerbates this issue, doesn't it? Located retroperitoneally against the posterior abdominal wall, they're surrounded by dense fascial networks and musculature.
Exactly. When an individual wakes, the surrounding tissue is rigid, cold, and poorly perfused.
And the kidneys, which require 20% of the total cardiac output to function optimally, are essentially starved of oxygenated blood.
They cannot initiate the necessary filtration of the mobilized toxins because the hydraulic pressure required to push blood through the glomerulus is simply absent.
This is the specific physiological deficit targeted by the second step of the protocol, a dedicated 2-minute, low-impact spinal mobilization routine.
The source prescribes movements analogous to a modified quadruped flexion extension, commonly known as a cat-cow maneuver, or a slow, seated spinal flexion.
Now, analyzing this from a strictly clinical perspective, prescribing a skeletal stretching routine for the preservation of an internal visceral organ requires a precise biomechanical justification.
It does. Stretching is universally understood as a mechanism to elongate sarcomeres, increase joint lubricity, and reduce tendinous tension.
Right, so the assertion that flexing the lumbar spine directly influences the glomerular filtration rate of a fist-sized internal organ challenges traditional anatomical compartmentalization. How does the mechanical manipulation of the external fascia translate to internal organ perfusion?
The connection lies in the intricate relationship between the thoracolumbar fascia and the renal vasculature. We must abandon the concept of stretching as mere muscular elongation.
And view it as mechanical therapy for the endothelium.
Precisely. When the spine undergoes controlled flexion and extension, it physically compresses and releases the deep tissues surrounding the renal capsule.
This mechanical manipulation creates a localized pumping mechanism. It is effectively a surrogate cardiovascular pump.
Yes. By mechanically compressing the tissue, you are inducing localized vasodilation. The physical shearing force applied to the blood vessels stimulates the endothelial cells lining those vessels to release nitric oxide.
And nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator. It rapidly relaxes the smooth muscle surrounding the arteries, increasing their diameter and radically decreasing vascular resistance.
The empirical data substantiating this mechanism is highly robust. A 2020 physiological assessment published by Harvard Medical School demonstrated this.
Right. They showed that regular targeted mechanical stretching of the lower extremities and lumbar region can enhance localized microvascular circulation by 20 to 25% in older adults.
A 25% increase in blood flow to an organ that relies entirely on hydrostatic pressure for its function is a massive clinical advantage.
You are fundamentally altering the hydraulic dynamics of the kidney, shifting it from a state of ischemic stagnation to optimal perfusion.
Furthermore, we must address the systemic inflammatory environment. The National Institute on Aging released data in 2018 detailing the endocrine response to acute low-intensity movement.
The research indicated a 15% reduction in circulating pro-inflammatory cytokines, such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, following routine mechanical stretching.
This is critical because chronic low-grade inflammation is the primary catalyst for glomerulosclerosis, the scarring of the delicate renal filters.
When inflammatory markers are elevated, the renal tissue responds with a fibrotic cascade, replacing functional filtration cells with rigid scar tissue.
By utilizing mechanical movement to suppress these inflammatory cytokines right at the onset of the day, we are actively inhibiting the fibrotic degeneration of the organ.
The clinical application of this biomechanical principle is beautifully illustrated through the case of Elena Roberts.
Yes, a 72-year-old patient exhibiting profound morning rigidity, severe localized lumbar fatigue, and delayed cognitive arousal upon waking.
Her established behavioral pattern was immediate sedentary behavior following sleep. She transitioned from a supine resting state to a seated resting state,
Perpetually maintaining the ischemic condition of her renal and lumbar vasculature. Her kidneys were trapped in a prolonged state of hypoxia.
Right. The cells lack the oxygen required for ATP production, halting their ability to actively transport toxins out of the bloodstream.
The prescribed intervention was the integration of a 2-minute spinal mobilization protocol prior to any seated behavior.
And following a 3-week adherence period, the patient reported the cessation of lumbar heaviness and, most notably, the sensation of internal warmth radiating through the lower posterior chain.
That reported sensation of warmth is the defining clinical marker of successful reperfusion.
It is the sensory nervous system registering the sudden influx of core temperature oxygenated blood into previously ischemic capillary beds.
Correct. The microvasculature surrounding the renal capsule was successfully dilated, permitting the cardiovascular system to deliver the requisite oxygen and fluid volume to the nephrons.
Now, it is imperative to note the protocol's adaptations for populations experiencing osteoarthritic degradation or spinal stenosis.
Yes, the objective is not maximum range of motion or achieving extreme flexion. If degenerative joint disease is present, the protocol demands micromovements.
Because the biological requirement is the mechanical shearing force to trigger nitric oxide release, not the maximization of flexibility.
Exactly. Sustained, gentle compression and release of the tissue are sufficient to initiate the necessary vasodilation.
So we have now established a physiological sequence. We have introduced a specific solvent via the citrate infusion, and we have activated the transportation network via biomechanical vasodilation.
The renal system is currently highly perfused, oxygenated, and actively engaged in the process of clearing the concentrated nocturnal toxins.
However, this brings us to the most critical and frequently mismanaged variable in the morning protocol. The final intervention addresses the metabolic burden of digestion.
Right. The common physiological assumption is that the transition from sleep to wakefulness dictates an immediate cessation of nighttime cellular repair.
And an instantaneous shift to daytime metabolic assimilation.
But that is a fundamental misunderstanding of chronobiology and circadian metabolism. The cessation of the sleep cycle does not instantly terminate the liver's detoxification pathways or the kidney's structural repair mechanisms.
The physiological cleanup is still actively occurring well into the first 2 hours of wakefulness.
Returning to our sanitation analogy, the arrival of daylight does not mean the streets are clean.
No, the workers are still actively processing the debris, utilizing the newly arrived water trucks and the improved road networks we just provided.
If, at this precise moment of intense functional demand, we introduce a massive, biochemically complex external workload, the system will inevitably fail to complete its primary restorative tasks.
And this systemic overload is triggered primarily by the premature ingestion of heavy proteins.
The standard Western morning diet frequently relies on dense, complex proteins, eggs, processed meats, and high-fat animal products.
When these dense macronutrients enter the gastric tract immediately upon waking, the entire metabolic priority of the body shifts.
The kidneys must immediately abandon their internal restorative processes and pivot their functional capacity to manage the catastrophic influx of nitrogenous waste.
Let us rigorously define why propylene metabolism poses such a specific threat to the renal architecture. The metabolism of carbohydrates and lipids primarily yields carbon dioxide and water,
Which are easily managed by respiration and simple excretion. Protein, however, contains nitrogen.
right? When the liver breaks down amino acids for energy or synthesis, it strips away the amino group through a process called deamination.
This produces ammonia, a highly toxic compound. The liver rapidly converts this ammonia into a less toxic substance called urea, which is then dumped into the bloodstream.
And the singular responsibility for removing that urea falls to the kidneys. When a heavy protein load is consumed, the concentration of urea in the blood spikes dramatically.
To clear this sudden influx of nitrogenous waste, the kidneys must drastically alter their internal hemodynamics. They initiate a process clinically defined as hyperfiltration.
The mechanics of hyperfiltration are deeply destructive over a longitudinal timeline. To increase the filtration rate, the blood vessels entering the microscopic renal filters, the efferent arterioles, dilate widely, allowing a massive surge of blood in.
Simultaneously, the vessels exiting the filters, the efferent arterioles, constrict. The physics of this are unavoidable.
You are increasing the input volume while aggressively restricting the output drain. The hydraulic pressure inside the glomerulus skyrockets.
This immense hydrostatic pressure forces the blood plasma through the delicate filtration slits at a highly accelerated rate, successfully clearing the urea.
But the collateral damage is severe. The specialized cells that wrap around the capillaries, known as podocytes, are subjected to extreme mechanical shear stress.
They are physically stretched by the ballooning pressure. Over time, these podocytes detach, the capillary walls weaken, and the body attempts to heal these micro-tears by laying down fibrotic scar tissue.
Which is the exact mechanism of glomerulosclerosis. By forcing the kidneys into hyperfiltration every single morning, we are mechanically destroying the filtration barrier.
The National Kidney Foundation's 2021 data confirms this trajectory, linking early heavy protein loads to accelerated nephron degradation in senior populations whose tissues already lack youthful elasticity.
To counteract this, the protocol establishes a specific temporal boundary, the golden window of digestion. This mandates a strict 60 to 120-minute fasting period from heavy proteins following the waking moment.
We must be absolutely precise regarding the nutritional science here. The protocol is not classifying dietary protein as pathogenic.
No, adequate protein intake is non-negotiable for the preservation of lean muscle mass, the synthesis of immunoglobulins, and the prevention of sarcopenia in older adults.
The pathology is not the macronutrient itself. The pathology is the timing of the metabolic load.
The Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health published the Nutritional Review in 2020, validating this exact temporal strategy.
Their analysis concluded that fractionating protein intake and delaying the initial heavy metabolic burden allows the endocrine and renal systems to stabilize their baseline functions before being subjected to the oxidative stress of complex digestion.
During this 1 to 2 hour stabilization window, the required nutritional intake must be highly specific.
The protocol dictates the consumption of complex, water-dense carbohydrates and soluble fibers.
Specifically, fresh fruits with high water content, soaked oats, or a very light, warm porridge. The biochemical logic here is quite elegant.
It is. These specific foods bypass the urea cycle entirely. They do not introduce nitrogenous waste into the bloodstream, meaning the glomeruli are not forced into the destructive state of hyperfiltration.
The hydrostatic pressure within the kidneys remains stable and low. Furthermore, the high intercellular water content of these foods continues the slow, steady osmotic hydration initiated by the citrate water.
Equally critical is the role of the soluble fiber. The beta-glucans in the soaked oats create a viscous gel in the gastric tract, significantly delaying gastric emptying.
This results in a slow, highly controlled release of glucose into the bloodstream. We avoid the violent spikes in blood sugar that trigger massive insulin releases.
Chronic hyperglycemia is profoundly toxic to the renal endothelium. By stabilizing the morning glycemic curve, we are protecting the microvasculature from glycation end products that stiffen the arteries.
Additionally, the polyphenols and antioxidants present in the fresh fruits provide an immediate defense against the reactive oxygen species generated during the final stages of the nighttime cellular cleanup.
The National Institute on Aging's 2019 report on gastrointestinal senescence notes that enzymatic production and metabolic clearance rates naturally decline with age.
The introduction of these easily assimilated low-toxicity foods respects the diminished functional reserve of the aging digestive and renal systems.
It provides essential ATP fuel for the day without commanding a physiological emergency response.
When we synthesize these three distinct interventions, we observe a highly orchestrated physiological strategy. It is not a collection of random wellness tips.
No, it is a sequential, biologically coherent protocol designed to manipulate internal hemodynamics and metabolic pathways.
First, we alter the chemical composition of the urine and introduce an essential solvent utilizing the citrate infusion, effectively neutralizing crystal formation and uric acid buildup.
Second, we manually override the cardiovascular stagnation of sleep using targeted spinal biomechanics to induce vasodilation and flood the retroperitoneal space with oxygenated blood.
Finally, we manipulate our metabolic timing, utilizing a specific fasting window to shield the glomeruli from the destructive shear stress of nitrogenous hyperfiltration, allowing the natural cellular repair cycles to complete their genetically programmed work.
The fundamental conclusion we must draw from this analysis is that organ longevity is rarely dictated by extreme medical interventions or singular therapeutic events.
Cellular preservation is a function of the microenvironment we create for our tissues day after day.
The nephrons do not fail overnight. They succumb to decades of minor, repeated mechanical and oxidative stresses. By aligning our morning behaviors with the physiological reality of the organ, we remove the friction that causes premature degradation.
This analysis forces us to confront a significant paradigm regarding human health. We have meticulously detailed how the renal system operates on a hyperspecific, biologically rigid timeline.
It demands a slow hemodynamic awakening, a precise sequence of chemical hydration, and a strict delay before assuming complex metabolic burdens.
Yet the architecture of modern society demands instantaneous metabolic readiness. We are required to wake up, consume dense caloric energy, and perform optimally within minutes of our circadian transition.
It begs the question, how much of our chronic, age-related metabolic pathology is not a failure of our biology, but a failure of our environment?
We are systematically forcing a highly delicate, chronobiologically dependent organism to operate on an artificial, pressurized schedule that inherently violates the mechanical and chemical limitations of its own organs. The science dictates that the body will not adapt to the schedule. The schedule must adapt to the biology.